Hey there, I am Barb Higgins, and this is 1,000 Tiny Steps. In this podcast, I share my stories of love, loss, triumph, and tragedy as I continue to retrace my steps and ponder what led to the death of my daughter Molly. By doing so, I hope to not only help myself, but to bring purpose and possibility to those who listen. If you are ready to laugh, cry, shake your head in disbelief, then tie, buckle, lace up, or slip on your shoes and join me as we begin our 1,000 Tiny Steps.
Hey everybody, Barb Higgins here, welcoming you to episode 175 of 1,000 Tiny Steps. In 1978, I was at gymnastics camp in Pembroke, New Hampshire. I was 14, turning 15, heading into my sophomore year in high school. I still thought of myself as a gymnast. I was a cheerleader in the fall. I was in the recovery process of sexual abuse and having told my parents about it. I was recovering from the fact that my mother remarried my father, but I felt altogether sort of okay. My birthday is July 29th. On July 26th of that year in England, a woman gave birth to the first test tube baby, IVF, in vitro fertilization. It was huge news, and I remember at the time thinking how weird and bizarre it was. Like, how can you make a baby outside the embryo, outside the womb? How do you make a baby in a test tube and then put it in the mother? You know, and at 15, I wasn't going to overly analyze sex and how reproduction works. I knew the gist of it. I didn't like thinking about sex much at all back then. But it was interesting news, and I remember it. I remember the news coverage. I remember looking at the baby. I remember the horrible things that people said on the news about it. The news wasn't like it is today. There was no internet. People didn't just say horrifying things from the safety of their living room that were now spread all over the interwebs. My life goes on. I don't think about it much more. But periodically in the news, all through my high school years and college years, my adult life, IVF, in vitro fertilization, becomes much more commonplace and much more practiced. Fast forward to the summer of 2016, when I'm no longer in my 20s, when I am in my 50s, and I started having the dreams about having a baby. I think even if I had not been in menopause, it would have been hard for me to get pregnant, even with just a little bit of help with like inducing better ovulation or whatever in my 50s. I think that I might have struggled. I don't know. But I remember when I was going through the process of deciding to do it and would I qualify, how much pushback I got from members of the medical community and people in my life over my age that I can logically make sense of. My mental well-being, was I crazy and nuts? I suppose I can understand that too. And then sometimes feeling, even with female medical practitioners, that I was being unreasonable and not logical or normal. Always, the first question asked of me when I was with a new medical provider was, did my partner approve? So I guess if you're talking about creating a life that you're going to bring into the world, a stable family would most likely be helpful. But I often wondered at the time, if it was a medical procedure for a guy, would they be asked if their partner would approve? So these are things I went round and round with in my own process. I've shared before that the steps that got me pregnant with Jack weren't quick. I went through a ton of testing that my insurance covered. I had to have a colonoscopy, and I was about that age to have one anyway. I needed to have a mammogram. I needed to have an EKG. I needed to have psychological testing, a complete physical, blood work, and I had to be approved for having a baby at my age by all of the professionals that were orchestrating these tests. I couldn't have cancer in my butt and make a baby. And that was just to be approved, like, okay, yes, we'll give it a start. And I went through all of that and then realized I didn't have the money. It's super expensive. That the insurance I had, primarily Medicaid, wouldn't cover in vitro fertilization. So home I went. And then when I went back to redo it, to restart the process, was when I went through a whole different round of testing. I didn't have to redo any of the other tests. I was up to date on all the big tests I had had. I had to have a new EKG and an updated physical. And it was in the process of going off all the crazy medication I was taking that I realized I needed to fix my mouth. And then we went through the whole brain tumor and all that. All during the process of the brain tumor treatment, my big fear was that my neurologist would simply say, it's not safe for you to be pregnant. He was on my side the whole time, and those words never came out of his mouth. In my season of lies and finding out common everyday things, the idea of doing an IVF episode has floated around. And this one will sort of lead into next week's episode, which would be around periods, because your periods play a big role in the IVF procedure. So I've been tossing it around. What would I do? So I looked up some lies. I started with my basic, what are some common misunderstandings about IVF? So the main one is that it's not successful, that you spend a ton of money and it doesn't work. Well, roughly 1 in 50 babies are born through IVF. So when you think of the number of babies born in the world on any given day, that's a pretty high ratio. And IVF is just, the petri dish conception. That doesn't include IUI, which is injecting sperm right into the uterus. That doesn't include, giving the mother medication to boost ovulation. My sister-in-law, Kathy, it's called Clomid. And she took Clomid, and 1 round of Clomid, and boom, she was pregnant with Kelsey. Those figures aren't included. So even more babies arrive because of help with fertility issues in the mother. Fertility issues in the father can also play a role. If the sperm doesn't work, there's no baby there. So oftentimes IVF is with a sperm donor. So it does work. And likely it probably works just as well in any given woman as, going off birth control and trying to get pregnant the natural way. I got pregnant first try every time. I got pregnant on the pill. I got pregnant first when Kenny and I decided, let's make a baby. We made Gracie. The only time I had sex after my first period with Molly, first time I had sex, I got pregnant with Molly after Gracie. So I wasn't concerned about my fertility going into IVF. And that is oftentimes, actually, that is most definitely not common. The number one reason people want an IVF pregnancy is because they cannot get pregnant naturally. So I guess I'd fit into that category. I couldn't just have sex with somebody and get pregnant at 53. I would need help. Age doesn't matter. That's considered a lie. I think that's true. I think age doesn't matter. To me, that would be true. Here's where age does matter. Truthfully speaking, the majority of women are most fertile in their late 20s, early 30s. It really does start to tank after 35. The medical community still calls a pregnancy after 35 a geriatric pregnancy, which all of mine were then. Gordy, Molly, Gracie, and of course, Jack. And in the early on IVF years, you had to be under 35 to even be considered. A larger number, ever-growing number of women that do IVF are in their 40s. Another thing that's often done now is women will extract and freeze their eggs, thinking that maybe what if they don't decide to have babies in time to do it naturally, and now they have their DNA all set. Then you get into all the lies that come around infertility itself. So infertility, in the Bible, a woman is considered barren. And it's like a huge blow to her as a woman because in lots of religious beliefs, the primary function of the woman is to have babies. So I want to be clear about something because this comes up in a lot of gender issues as well. The female body is the body that has babies. No matter what you call it, no matter who lives in it, no matter what it looks like or how healthy or unhealthy it is, it's the female version of the human body that has the baby. It's the male version of the human body that fertilizes the egg in the female so the baby grows. So yes, women who find that they can't have babies have devastating reactions to that, especially if they truly want babies. Yes, they can adopt and foster, but you're not growing your own baby. You're not reproducing yourself in a form of yourself. It's quite different. And then there was a lot of judgment placed on these women. Now, a lot of women in the Bible, maybe a woman got married and never got pregnant because her husband was the one with the problem. But it was never assumed that it was the male problem. It was always the woman isn't getting pregnant, so the woman is barren. This radical acceptance of, oh, well, I guess it's God's wish that I never have kids is hard to take, especially in a modern society when there is so much we can do to make these things happen. Another lie around IVF is that stress is what causes infertility and stress is what causes IVF not to work. I will share, but in my process, my IVF journey, a number of times I was told to go home and not worry about it, to keep my stress low was too many to count. And I think that's because in general, especially in American culture, stress is the number one cause of illness. So if you're stressed out and you get sick and you're trying to make a baby, I suppose that could be a bad connection. But in terms of a direct result of stress on the embryo trying to grow in your body, there's no connection that's proven in studies. IVF causes cancer. No, no more than having a baby naturally would cause cancer. The conception in a test tube isn't causing cancer to you. IVF is an increased risk of multiples. So yes, sometimes the first question somebody asks is, oh, you have twins. Did you conceive them naturally? I wanted to have twins, and I had 2 embryos implanted. And we all know the one and only Jack took over my uterus, and he's here. Sometimes embryos can split. So sometimes there are, I have a friend did IVF and they put 1 embryo in and 2 embryos came. So I don't know. And I didn't do any heavy research on that. I would say that initially in IVF, they used to implant several embryos thinking, okay, we got to put 5 in so at least 1 takes. And what would happen is 4 of them would work or they'd all work. So you have to be careful sometimes around that. I remember in my counseling, when I said I wanted 2 embryos implanted, one of the surgeons, the high risk doctors, and a doctor at the Elliott Hospital here in Manchester, New Hampshire, told me that putting 2 in increased the likelihood that I would have triplets or even 4, and that I would have to be willing to do selective reduction. And I just thought that was bizarre that he would warn that of me, that they would split, like this was a common thing. In my minimal amount of research for this episode, I didn't find that. IVF is unsafe. So when I am criticized, and believe me, go Google my name and read any article about me around my IVF journey. If you go on my website, 1000tinysteps.com, there's a press page and you can read and go on YouTube and see all of them. And they're rife with comments. Oh my goodness. And a large number of the comments talk about how unsafe it was for me to do that I put myself at risk and how cruel that was to do to Gracie, how I'm old and I'm going to die before my child, can brush his teeth by himself. Having lost a 13-year-old child, I have no control over when I'm going to die. It could be tomorrow. It could be in 40 years from now. I'd be 101. So yeah, 40 years from now. Holy crap. Those were 7 sort of common myths or misunderstandings or beliefs about IVF that are not scientifically proven to be true. So I thought, okay, great. I'll do a little talk about IVF. So I'm on Netflix, scrolling away. Actually, I saw this movie the same day I saw the shopping movie from the episode a few weeks ago. I'm on Netflix, and when I'm bored or I want to watch TV, but I don't know what I want to watch, I go on Netflix and I just click on all the upcoming movies and TV shows, and I watch the trailers. It's enough to keep me occupied for the 20 minutes I have to be on the TV without starting a show and not being able to finish. And lo and behold, the first movie I came upon was the movie about Amazon that I talked about a few episodes ago. And the second movie was Joy. So does my TV listen to me and send me things to watch that match what I'm talking about? So Joy, The Birth of IVF is a movie that celebrates primarily a woman named Jean Purdy, who was a major piece of the team that created the first test tube baby, the one that happened in 1978. There was a scientist named Bob Edwards who spent hours and hours in a lab impregnating mice and rats and rabbits and hamsters and working with other researchers to see if they could eventually see what it took to create embryos outside the uterus and to see if putting them back in would allow them to grow. And he meaning Bob Edwards, hired a lab, someone to run his lab, and her name was Jean Purdy, and she was a nurse and also an embryonologist. So she ended up working with them for the 10 plus years it took to create the first test tube baby, so to speak, and then was influential in setting up lab for them, like a facility where women could go and have IVF. The third person that was a part of this team was a man named Patrick Steptoe. He was an obstetrician, and he was a leader in laparoscopic surgery. So they used to cut women open to look at their reproductive organs to get information on them. And when laparoscopes started being invented and looked at, and how do you make that work, cameras and all that, he was an obstetrician, and he thought, oh my God, what a great way to look at endometriosis. What a great way to look at things that could be going on with women or with reproductive health. And so the movie is essentially about that whole process. It actually starts with a ceremony, which was done in, I think, 2010, when Edwards won the Nobel Prize for this whole thing happening. By that time, Steptoe had passed away. He was an elderly physician when all this went down in his 70s. And Jean Purdy had passed away. She died at age 39 of cancer. I'm going to walk you through the movie a little bit because, like my whole movie episode a couple weeks ago, this movie also had some inconsistencies, things that weren't true. So the movie is based on Jean, primarily Jean. It starts with her, it ends with her. And the whole ceremony around a plaque that's on the hospital in England where the first IVF transfer took place didn't have her name on it for a long, long time. And she was often left out of news articles about it. And both Edwards and Steptoe say that it never would have happened if it weren't for Jean Purdy, that she was the glue that held it together. So in the movie, she is a devout Catholic, and her mother's a devout Catholic. And one of the major plot twists in the movie is that her mother disowns her, and the church sort of says she can't come to church anymore until she's ready to mend her ways. And that's heart-wrenching. The main reason the Catholic Church was and still is against IVF is two things. One is making light of conception, that the miracle of creating a baby comes from God, and to minimize it by doing it in a petri dish minimizes the miracle. Okay, maybe God also gave us brains to create these things. And the second is that lots of embryos are just quote unquote destroyed. They're not put into uteruses to see if they grow. They don't die a natural death. They're never used and they're destroyed. So they consider that abortion. And I have to be honest, I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, that goes round and round in my head sometimes too. One of the things, if I hadn't been able to do my IVF experience myself, Kenny and I had talked about adopting embryos. There are frozen embryos that people have given up for adoption. So you can go on this website and look at the biology of the parents. And I actually have a couple of friends in my life that have frozen embryos that have said, hey, if you ever want to have another one, you can have one of my embryos. So that eases my heart, because I feel that if there's a soul at conception, then we have millions of souls living in freezers in these little unfertilized embryos. So I don't know. I can't wrap my head around that quite yet. So Jean continues in the work, even though she no longer has a relationship with her mother, because she's unbelievably dedicated to it. There's a sort of undercurrent of depression with Jean. She gets involved in a relationship, but she says, you can't fall in love with me. I'll sleep with you, but just don't get attached. She's oftentimes sad. As the research gets better and they start to actually be able to fertilize human eggs and they actually begin to grow outside the uterus, you notice like a melancholy in her. And then what you come to find out is that she has endometriosis and that she can't conceive or get pregnant. It's logical then, her passion for the work. Another major character in the movie is a woman, her name is Muriel, and she's a nurse in charge of Steptoe's clinic. And she calls herself matron because she's the head nurse. And there's a whole scene where Jean calls her Muriel, and Muriel yells at her and says, matron might be a title to you, but it's important to me. And she's played by a Black woman who is of West Indian descent in the description of her character. There really was a Muriel in the movie who was a white British citizen, but that character was a legitimate character. She was the one that did all of the nursing tasks. So anytime there was a medical procedure, she was the nurse that was there with the doctor, Steptoe. In 1969, that was the first extraction attempt from a female, extracting a natural egg because of the laparoscopy. And that was successful. They were able to do it. It took them a long time to get an egg to fertilize. And a lot of that had to do with the serum and the liquid that the egg was sitting in. What do you put it in to keep it balanced and hormonally accurate? Like what would mimic the uterus? I mean, the science that goes into all this is mind-boggling. It actually reminds me a bit of when Molly was on life support and I saw how many bags of fluid and how many IVs it took to keep someone alive on life support. It wasn't just oxygen, it was body function because the brain was dead. You're doing things for the brain. At this time, their work was getting some notoriety, some newspaper and radio coverage, and they were called Frankenstein. It was Frankenstein's lab. You know, Dr. Frankenstein created the monster that killed everybody that goes by Frankenstein. They were compared to Frankenstein. They weren't creating monsters. They were trying to recreate humans, bypassing conception inside the body of the mother. A lot of their early egg donations came from women who had had hysterectomies. They were approached and said, would you be willing to be part of a study? Can we extract eggs from you and see if we can fertilize them and see how long we can keep them alive and all of this? Years of work extracting eggs from women that didn't have uteruses, so there was no having babies for them. Now, of course, if you don't have a uterus, you can extract your own eggs and your partner's sperm and hire a surrogate to grow your baby. So you can have your own genetic material baby, you just don't grow it. And the baby you get was grown with someone else's DNA swirling around. So that's another whole interesting aspect to this. As the movie goes along, Jean continues to try to rekindle a relationship with her mother, and her mother feels that Jean is playing God. The clinic that all of this is going on also performs abortions. And there's a scene in the movie where Jean really has a hard time with this. And she and the nurse have a conversation that's pretty profound. Not sure if it's true or not. But Jean says to the nurse, we're here to make babies, not kill them. And the nurse says, no, we're not. We're here to give women choice in all aspects of their life. As a pro-choice person who remembers, who was 10 when Roe v. Wade came into play, who remembers stories told to him by my grandmother and great-grandmother about taking the train to Pennacook to some guy's apartment where you could have an abortion. These horror stories, you know? So that was an intense scene for me. And it sort of didn't sit right with the other aspect of Jean that had sex, you know, was in relationships. And I guess one doesn't matter. You can sleep with a lot of people and still think abortion's bad. I don't know, that struck me just having watched all of the social struggles around these issues. Women are supposed to be virgin-like, right? So anyway, this was a key piece of the conflict within Jean, giving up her relationship with her mother, not going to church anymore, working in a clinic that also performed abortions when she was fundamentally against it. And I think even as she understood it, she remained that way. One of the other big fears as this began to take hold was that the babies created would be abnormal babies. And if you let them be born, what are we going to kill them now? Like there was a TV scene where a scientist that was really at the forefront of DNA and genetic testing was on with Bob Edwards. And they were arguing back and forth how they were both the same thing. You're playing with fire, so to speak. Edwards was accused of being was going to be a baby killer. If the baby's born deformed, you make it live deformed. Throwing out all this fear. And the audience is screaming and yelling. It's a pretty intense scene in the movie. And as a woman, as a female-bodied human, it was so insulting to me because women were being portrayed as having to shoulder the whole brunt of this. Even though conception requires two people, or the the DNA material from two people, it was really considered evil and bizarre and morally corrupt. And 40 years later, we're used to it now, right? 44 years later, 46 years later, we're used to it now. I mean, 12 million babies have been conceived through IVF now since this movie, since Louise Brown. So, she's a woman in her late 40s, and an IVF birth sometimes it's newsworthy, but not really. Lots and lots of people have them. A crucial part in the movie comes when Jean finds out her mother is sick. And in terms of the IVF, they've tried several times now to take its fertilized embryo and implant it. And they've had some success. What they don't have success with is the inside part. They get the embryo implanted, but they can't make it stay in the uterus where it belongs. They have ectopic pregnancies. And this was long before ultrasound and that sort of thing, but the embryo isn't even there anymore when, a couple of weeks later, an embryo is microscopic, you don't see it. Or it dies, it doesn't live because it can't implant and be nourished. You have all of these hormones to control. You have to control the hormones of the mother to extract eggs with a needle from the uterus. Then you have to control the embryo in the petri dish as you fertilize it, put it in a solution that allows it to grow and develop enough to be implanted. Then once it's implanted, it has to be at its size at the right point in a woman's cycle where there's enough uterine lining for the egg to implant. Having gone through IVF and the number of medication adjustments, shots in my butt, patches, pills, sometimes no shots, just patches and pills, sometimes no patches, just shots and pills, sometimes just pills, sometimes all three. And then 2 different kinds of pills, sometimes just estrogen, sometimes also progesterone. So it goes around and around. And having been a part of it and seeing how differently I felt throughout all these cycles, it's mind-boggling that the body just can do this sort of all automatically in perfect situations. So as the media coverage was getting more negative, more and more couples were reaching out. But after several failures and really not knowing how to make it work, Jean finds out her mother is dying of cancer. And so she quits. I'm out. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I have to take care of my mother. And everything sort of falls apart. In the study, it stops. So Jean doesn't realize it stopped. I don't know how long she was gone from the program, maybe a year or a year and a half, before she realized that it was no longer happening. Because when her mother died, Dr. Steptoe and nurse Muriel, matron, came to the funeral. Once her mother's gone, Jean gets back into it. So she also started relooking at her notes, and she came up with a thought that rather than try to coerce a schedule, a cycle for the woman, that they should facilitate the natural cycle. So, extracting an egg would facilitate ovulation, right? If you got pregnant right after ovulation, you would go into pregnancy. So I don't know the details of how they did this. I know that now you don't have to put the egg back in right away. You can take it out, fertilize it. It can be frozen for a bit. When you do take it out, typically when you extract eggs, the eggs sit for a while. The woman has a couple of months and they don't put them together until the woman is ready and at the right place to grow the baby. Back then, it all had to be at once. There was no holding on to the eggs and holding on to the sperm. It was much more, it all must be done now. They had to really maneuver and manipulate women's cycles. Jean is the one who came up with a lot of this. In her time away and in her research in the last days of her mother's life, she, according to the movie, came up with all this. So she rejoins the study. They get the scientist back on board and the doctor back on board. One of the things Jean had done, both before she left and after her return, was to start to participate in the Ovum Club. And it was the women in the study who would come together oftentimes at the same clinic, going through the shots and the tush and everything else. they could commiserate with one another and they supported one another and they would socialize together. There's a beach scene when they go to the beach. No one's sure if that actually happened, but the Ovum Club actually did exist, and Jean was incredibly involved in this. And a major piece of her contribution is considered to be connected to the well-being of the women involved, that it was very easy to just look at them as test subjects. And sometimes in science, it's easier that way because you get so emotionally caught up in the well-being and happiness of your subjects, so to speak, that if you can stay separate emotionally, it's easier on you. That was another major way that she contributed. When she came back after her mother's death, Jean left the study in 1973. When she came back in 1975, in the movie, they create this great scene where they're all sort of arguing and fighting over what went wrong with it. Essentially, it was a serum that the fertilized embryo was in that wasn't balancing out. It wasn't keeping the embryo alive, so it couldn't do what it needed to do to implant when it was put into the uterus, and it would often float up into the fallopian tube. They had a hard time positioning the egg, and it was embryonic. It was also related to the cycle, which is Jean's piece. In this scene, they sort of all mutually blame one another for quitting. Jean says, I had no choice to quit. My mother was dying. And the scientist says, well, it still was a choice, and they go back and forth about who was to blame, and they realize no one was to blame. So in 1975, the three of them really get together and figure out, all right, let's get back and do this. So they have a different serum now. They have a different mindset around how to control the cycle of the woman and the hormones. They have a better understanding of the timing. And so in August of 1977, they fertilize an embryo that does really well. They get the solid embryo out, they fertilize it, it starts to multiply immediately, it's doing really well. And so they go through the whole process of egg extraction, fertilization, looking at it in the test tube. You watch the IVF procedure where they insert the embryo into the uterus. So I went through this twice. The first time, it was a big crew of people. Kenny was there. It didn't work. And I just knew really only a few days out from that first implantation. But I laid back. I'm in a room full of people, ass to the grass, knees to the breeze. And they take it, they come in with all this equipment, and it's a needle with stuff in it. And they, dilate my cervix and put the needle up, and in goes the baby. And I can watch it on a TV screen. And there's something in there that makes the embryo, there's something in the solution that makes the embryo stand out and be like almost bright green. So I can see it. I can see that it's in there on the TV screen because there's an ultrasound going on. Watching the scene in the movie, it struck me how it wasn't really very different at all. So much of it was done manually, meaning when you extracted an embryo and you put it in the solution, somebody carried that with their hands to the lab where it would be matched with the sperm. And now this all happens, you're not carrying a loose, open-lidded solution, hand carrying it in. It's a bit more protected now. But the scenario was the same. There she was, knees to the breeze. Her husband wasn't there. That might have been just because it was the 1970s. I think it's different now because I wanted Kenny to be there. It was just fun watching it because I could relate to the whole scene. So the pregnancy takes. Not only the pregnancy take, but the pregnancy continues. It's not ectopic. It carries along. At this point in the movie, when Louise Brown's mother is huge and pregnant, it all focuses now on the birth and what is this going to mean for the IVF world. At this time, the movie shares that Jean has endometriosis, and she has an exam by the doctor who had reached out to her in the movie prior to see if she wanted help. In the movie, they do this quick pelvic exam, which is when you lie on your back with your knees to the breeze, and it's like the doctor puts his hands up there, fingers up there, and pushes it around and looks with a speculum and all. And in the movie, a quick pelvic exam was enough for the doctor to say, you will never have babies. That's unrealistic. I think it was done that way because she didn't ever go through with a laparoscopy to see if there was anything going on in there. So that part of the movie actually isn't quite accurate. Jean did have endometriosis, but none of them know. No one really knows how much of a role that played in her involvement in the IVF work. There's a scene in the movie, though, where the doctor says to her, I'm afraid science isn't quite ready for you yet. And that's actually incredibly accurate because along with laparoscopy and IVF and all of the research around hormonal control and contribution to issues with women, endometriosis is now a major contributor to infertility, but not one that deems you infertile forever. There's a lot that doctors can do with it now. So I think sometimes that might be why it was put in the movie. There's another beautiful scene. So the mother has the baby, and it's this amazing thing, and they celebrate. There's a picture. I looked up the actual picture on the internet, but they show at the end of the movie where they show the actual people. In the movie, there's a picture of the doctor and the scientist holding the baby, and they get Jean to come and stand in the middle. And it's a beautiful, beautiful moment. And if that's based on an actual reconstruction of what happened after that baby was born. The baby was born crying, healthy, normal, happy. Here's this mom and dad with their new baby. It was delivered by C-section. So many things they weren't sure of that now you know ahead of time through amniocentesis and ultrasounds and all the testing that women can have while they're pregnant. I had all of it to make sure Jack was healthy. It was all those things were unknown back in 1978. So after that, all of the coming down from the high, and the doctor talks about how the hardest part of his experience in World War II as a doctor on a ship was deciding in times of crisis who could be saved and who wasn't. And he always felt like he was choosing who lived or died, which ultimately he was, and that haunted him. And that's what he hated the most about the IVF procedures. All these women would come and he would want to help all of them. But he had to look at their situation and say, you know what? You're not a good candidate. I know now there's so much more that goes into choosing whether or not you qualify for IVF other than just your infertility, that I think sometimes more women can be accepted into the program now than was true back then. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm speculating based on my own improvement. The movie ends outside of Kershaw Hospital, which is where the lab was located because that's where Steptoe, the OBGYN, worked. There's a plaque in the hospital to acknowledge that the first ever IVF baby was at that hospital. And initially, they only had the doctor and the scientist's name on there. And there was a huge push to rededicate the plaque to make sure that Jean's name was also on there. And it is. So if you went to visit that hospital in England, you would see her name on the plaque. I have to admit, I cried a lot. In their practice up to that point, from 1967 to 1978, they treated 282 women. 282 women came for help. They had 5 pregnancies and 2 successful births. Since then, since 1978, 12 million women have given birth through IVF, me being one of them. So because I had just done the episode on movies and how much is true and how much isn't, I went online and looked what's accurate and what isn't. And because of the nature of the movie, I think, and because of how easy it is now to get information, the factual stuff is all exact and perfect according to the people involved. The main fictional parts were the backstories, the doctor, the scientists and his family and his marriage to that, and the relationship with Aaron. They don't really know that Jean ever had a relationship that was described. One of the other scientists in the movie was a bit angry that Jean had been portrayed as somebody that would have sex outside of marriage, somebody that would sleep around, and party and that sort of thing. She was not portrayed by any means as a loose or a sexually promiscuous person. But there's a scene where she says to her mother, I've been having unprotected sex since 1967. I can't get pregnant. I think sometimes those things are put in to make points and to solidify a point of a movie. I get it. It reminds me of a lot of the things and liberties taken with movies like Remember the Titans and all this. Now, these characters aren't alive anymore. For the characters that are alive, the women that have had babies via IVF, getting the facts right was important. Getting the facts right in a scientific process that now makes mothers worldwide able to have babies had to be factual. So most of what went on in the movie was as it happened. It's not likely that Jean Purdy was super sexually liberated. She was very, very conservative, and a lot of her conservative nature made some of the aspects of IVF difficult for her, the willful destruction of an embryo. Having said that, one of the main things that causes IVF to fail is not the mother. It's not the uterus. It's not any of the external things. It's the integrity of the embryo. That sometimes when you extract eggs and add sperm, you look at the embryos and you choose the ones that look the most healthy. There are certain markers they have to meet, and you put those in the mummy, and then you discard the rest. It's sort of like an early on miscarriage. Lots and lots of women miscarry. Before there were pianistic pregnancy tests, you could miscarry and think you were just having a heavy period. So if you want to compare the number of embryos that are destroyed in IVF process and the number of miscarriages that early on that women used to have long before early pregnancy tests, it's probably not super different. And I'll take flack for saying that, but I know that it looks like miscarriages have risen, and it's just that we know we're pregnant like the moment we're pregnant now, which we didn't years and years ago. Some of the fictional aspects are really around the character of Jean, the backstory, her mother. Yes, she was close to her mother. Yes, her mother died of cancer. Yes, they went to church. All those things were accurate, but there's no clear proof that she was ever excommunicated or that she and her mother stopped talking. Did it cause strife? Most likely. The nurse, again, I mentioned that matron, Muriel, the nurse, in real life was white and born in England. But there was an influx of West Indian nurses in British history that came to Great Britain and volunteered their time. I think it was in a war effort. And it might have been a tribute. It was like a casting tribute to recognize the West Indian nurses that played such a pivotal role in a lot of health issues in Great Britain. The ovum club was real, but they don't know if they went out on a trip. Endometriosis, yes, Jean had it, but it was unlikely that it was actually like it was portrayed in the movie. So you never really knew if Jean was truly infertile or if she just never had babies. The OBGYN, the elder guy that died, Dr. Steptoe, he died old age, natural causes. And Jean died again at age 39 of cancer. So she only lived a handful of years after this movie took place. What is interesting is she was the major fundraiser to create an independent hospital, to build a hospital, a facility specifically for IVF in Great Britain. The hospital that was used initially wanted no part of becoming the go-to place. They wanted to maintain their autonomy as a hospital. So what did I think of it? I think I cried and cried like a baby listening to that first IVF baby cry. I've walked around bumping into walls since watching the movie, remembering every minute of my pregnancy with Jack and how lucky I feel. And also, to be perfectly honest, I'm a person who believes that when we die and go on to the next life, that we have our reckoning with God or our higher power, whatever. And I know that there are aspects of IVF that are religiously controversial in all religions, including mine. But again, the Baha'i faith doesn't take political stances. They leave all choices up to the believers. In my reading of IVF in the faith, all of the questions it asked me, I followed through on. So I feel okay about it. But I certainly, I had gone through menopause. My time to have babies was over. And I manipulated my body so that I could have a baby. And I still nurse Jack. He's 3.5 and Boop is still a daily part of his life. So Joy, the History of IVF. It's on Netflix. I think it's awesome and you should watch it. That's what I think. I'm glad that they maintain integrity of the story. History of IVF. It'll be interesting in America with the political changes that are coming up now in a couple of weeks as of this publication. If IVF can continue the way that it has, I certainly hope so. I think that women are often the ping pong ball in the ping pong game of life when it comes to political issues and medicine. I think that there are a lot of, misconceptions around IVF and things that people don't understand. But I do know that it is miraculous that medical professionals can recreate the miracle of life outside of the body and allow women to grow babies and have them. I go back to the analogy of the man on the roof praying for God to save him. And a boat goes by and a canoe goes by and a helicopter comes and the man says, no, God will save me. And when he gets to heaven, God says, I sent you a boat, I sent you a canoe, I sent you a helicopter. You said no. And I feel sometimes that, yes, perhaps conception is holy and a miracle and should be ordained by God. But the people that created the ability for it to happen in a lab were given their smarts by the same God that people say controls conception. So, sometimes I think it's how we look at it, how our prayers are answered and how our beliefs are interpreted. That's my IVF episode. Next week, I'll talk about periods, menstruation. So be good to yourself. Be good to yourself. Support someone. Support yourself in your IVF journey. Take good care of yourself. Try to have a baby if you want one. Take that first tiny step. Be good to someone else. Support clinics that support women or support women that you know. Just be supportive when it comes to women and their bodies. And as always, have a good day, everyone.
Hey, thanks for listening and supporting the podcast. Feel free to leave a review and share my stories with your friends. Please reach out with your own stories, as I love connecting with my listeners. If you would like to get to know Molly, head over to mollybfoundation.org to see what she is all about. If you want to see what I'm up to next, you can find me on Instagram at barb_444, on Facebook as Barb Higgins, and at my website, 1000tinysteps.com. And while you're there, sign up for my newsletter, a weekly way to find out what's up in the life of Barb Higgins.